the major periods of Egyptian history. So you talk a little bit about the Bronze Age collapse. What is social complexity and what are the overlaps between different places? That maybe Egyptian ideas of justice were a little bit more advanced than we initially thought. Do we know if people were monogamous? Was something like per capita economic growth actually possible in the ancient world?
There are very few places in the world. I guess China would be the other one, but really Egypt offers a historian a chance to look at what we call the long-term history, la longue durée in French.
In this conversation, I'm speaking with Joe Manning, a professor of classics and history at Yale Law School. His specialized historical focus is the Hellenistic period and Ptolemaic Egypt. Enjoy my conversation with Professor Joseph Manning. When you're in Egypt, Can you feel the historical experience when you're there? Do you get a sense of the ancient history that exists?
Yeah, I think so. In certain places when you go to Egypt, I mean, you'll see ancient Egypt in your face. If you go to the Giza Plateau there, the pyramids, I mean, you're directly confronting these massively impressive monuments that are 4,500 plus years old. Yeah, so there are sites like that. If you go inside a tomb in Upper Egypt, that is very much part of ancient Egypt. I mean, it feels, if you go on a Nile cruise, which if you go to Egypt, you tend to do, you can, in Upper Egypt, you see all the temples as you cruise either up or down river. And it feels a little bit that way. And you see farmers in traditional farming. That's not ancient Egypt, though. So we have to. This is one of the things about Egypt. It's like India or like China. I mean, these are extremely ancient civilizations, but there are modern civilizations now there that are quite different. Even though there's some traditional aspects of how people live, not because they're primitive or antiquated, but because some farming techniques or whatever. I mean, they still sort of work in that environment. So. Yeah, that's the thing I would caution. Sometimes a guide will say, look, it's just like ancient Egypt. We see villagers, we see farmers farming with oxen and traditional plow and so on. But that would be unfair. I think that would be skipping some steps. The modern world, modern mentalities, et cetera, they're very much in the Egyptian countryside, of course. If that makes sense. I was so you can still see ancient things there, all the monuments, the tombs, some of them anyway, but the life is quite different.
Yeah, okay. No, that's fair. I would have thought so. So we'll get to the Ptolemaic period in a second and Hellenistic history, but just to start, like for people who aren't familiar, because people just think ancient Egypt and the pyramids, their mind goes straight to the pyramids. Just lay out the major of Egyptian history. Can you talk a little bit, briefly, I guess, and take us up to where you specialize in that?
Okay, I mean, one of the great
things a hard thing to do really briefly, but
it is, especially
for some context.
In the morning, I feel like I'm back in graduate school now. This is my nightmare. I'm still at an exam. So, I mean, one of the great things about studying Egypt and Egyptian history is it's a very long, continuous history. There are very few places in the world. I guess China would be the other one, and be some traditional civilizations, perhaps, but really Egypt offers a historian a chance to look at what we call the long-term history, la longue durée in French. You can see a lot of changes, and really for Egypt, we have to go back to the 6th millennium BC, so 5,000 BC, a little bit before, when we get agriculture coming. I mean, humans have been in the Nile Valley long before that. Some of the earliest modern skeletal remains of Homo sapiens have been found in the Egyptian Nile River Valley. So this is an extremely ancient place. But in terms of civilization, it really begins when the Egyptians start to farm, when the Nile allowed farming and responding to this annual flood of the river and so on. And that goes back 5,000 BC plus. So, we're talking many millennia of history. We finally get what we call civilization with writing and monuments and so on, 3,100 BC. This is called the pre-dynastic period. There aren't ruling families controlling the whole of the river valley yet. That's a long process, probably a couple thousand years, which we don't fully understand, but it's a long process. Then we eventually get ruling families that are controlling considerable chunks of Egypt from Aswan up through the Delta. I mean, around 3000 BC, the first dynasties we have, and then we have about 2600 BC. I'm giving you approximate dates. Um, the centralized state we call the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, the first great stage of Egyptian civilization, fairly advanced, sophisticated writing, a bureaucratic structure, temples, religious practices of various kinds, the full on what we call civilization, and a centralized state run by a ruler controlling much of the Egyptian Nile River Valley. And then we go in these phases of centralized dynasties and then decentralized periods, which I don't like the name of. Egyptologists are really terrible at coming up with names of their periods. So we have the Old Kingdom, the first phase of advanced Egyptian civilization, centralized political power, and that gradually fades away, centralized control for various reasons, including Nile flood problems, probably. And we have a first intermediate period, which is a crazy term that means nothing, for about 150 years. This is what historians want to know more about. We'll get back to that maybe at the end here, because these are not periods of darkness, really, although we don't know much about them. But these are periods when things were reinvented. The entire society was reinvented after a time of chaos for various reasons that we can get into if you want to. So a centralized state is reformed around 2000 BC after a 150-year hiatus of no centralized control. People are still living and probably pretty happy generally because there isn't a state and a tax man coming around demanding taxes. Maybe it may have been a better time, but we call this intermediate period. And then the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was called the Classical Age of Egypt. Very beautiful art, very beautiful literature for the first time. I think for the first time in the world, we have literature as political propaganda. A whole series of beautiful stories that we still have preserved in this period. And then that also goes away eventually after several hundred years. And we have a second intermediate period, which is very interesting. And a lot of outsiders are coming in, which really then helps to form what we call the Age of Empire, the New Kingdom, which is when Egypt's at its most, at the height of its political power in the Eastern Mediterranean. It dominates the Eastern Mediterranean all the way up to modern day Turkey. And horses, chariots. You can think of King Tut, who was, a minor player, but we have his tomb. So the New Kingdom is a military age. It's an age of horse and chariot. It is the Age of Empire, and then that eventually. So these three centralized periods they're several hundred years long each, which we shouldn't forget. Which is there aren't many places in the world anywhere at any time that have centralized political power for 500 years at a stretch. We should remember that. A lot of interesting and probably good things from the point of view of what a state are happening. Whether life is good for farmers, we can talk about. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Keep going.
I was just gonna say, people don't really realize like the extent, like the depth of history here. Like we're talking thousands of years. It's actually hard to imagine, isn't it? Like, it's an extremely long time.
It is hard to imagine, and it's really hard for historians because of the nature of the evidence. We don't, we have bits and pieces of great evidence, but they're bits and pieces. And so with thousands of years we just ran through until we get to the first millennium BC, we can compress things, and we don't often see change. We kind of stress continuity, which is a huge mistake. But this is a problem of looking back, and you tend to compress time because of the nature of the evidence we have. We just have dots, and we connect dots, and we say, "Oh, look, there's continuity because there's still Pharaoh running Egypt," or something like that. Let's say, but there's tremendous change in Egypt, and this idea that Egypt's like it's timeless, and there's such a thing as ancient Egypt, is completely false.
I'm just going to jump in there for a second with a period of change. So we're getting a bit closer to your area of expertise, but could you talk a little bit about the Bronze Age collapse, what the Bronze Age collapse actually was, and how it
Oh dear.
reshaped Egypt as well.
Oh wow.
Yeah, hard,
Yeah.
big questions.
Big question, very controversial.
Yeah,
It's something I don't believe in, to be honest. But I mean, this has dominated the archaeology of the Mediterranean for a century, um, for lots of reasons, including Homer, and there are a lot of things implicated in this. So the Bronze Age collapse is a period beginning roughly 1200 BC, 1200 BC. In that century, 1150, 1150s, is sort of the crisis point when a lot of civilizations, the Hittites, the Egyptian dynasty, the end of the New Kingdom, the city states in the Near East, Mycenaean civilization in Greece, they all seem to go away roughly at the same time, and it's a disaster everywhere. Now I think that's overblown. Actually, there's a lot happening. There's tremendous change. And the word collapse tends to imply that something happens overnight, that here one day and then everything is gone. Everything is like a deserted wasteland the next day. There's a lot of migration. There's a lot of movement of what archaeologists call the sea peoples, which is not a great term. It's people who are on boats, but it's many different ethnic groups that are highly mobile and running around, and they tend to be difficult for centralized states to control. That's a feature of ancient Egyptian states. Ancient states in general, I should say. Anyway, and the sea peoples have been again kind of compressed as they're the ones who caused this collapse of all these empires: the Egyptian Empire, the Hittite Empire, these great commercial city states in the Near East, Mycenaean Greece, and so again, that's telescoping, collapsing a lot of history actually over at least 200 years. So this is a long process. There is migration, there is movement of people. In part, it's a feature of Mediterranean history, mobility, movement, and we can think not long after this of the Phoenicians after 1000 BC. Anyway, it's a dark period archaeologically, although it isn't really. It used to be thought of as, well, we know nothing. It's just everything goes away. What's driving that? Well, the usual culprit is climate change. It is implicated. It is part of it. There's a lot of work now on this. There is drought in the Eastern Mediterranean in various places. That seems absolutely sure, and it's extended. But it's not the cause of collapse. It's certainly a stressor in various places. But and I'm being controversial here, but I tend to think that we're looking at is a major period of transition of economic life in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is the period we go from the Bronze Age to the emergence of the Iron Age, which is a fundamentally different technology. So and that drives a lot of other things. We just look at early Iron Age states compared to the Bronze Age states. It's a different world. It's not just things disappear and things reemerge eventually. It is a different world. The states are different. Religion is different. Cities are much larger. It's significant changes, political, religious, economic, even military to some extent. So what tends to go away, I think, are old ways of doing business, like these big palace-centered economies. The way Egypt works with the king controlling significant part of trade, let's say. The Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and the so-called palaces there. The structure of these economies are all sort of, they look sort of centralized and controlled by a big man, let's say. Again, that is forgetting about a lot of other evidence. It's sort of simplifying things. But the Iron Age, then all of a sudden we have the Phoenicians that seem to emerge out of nowhere, and they're dominating Mediterranean trade all the way to Spain, for example. And that's really interesting. And it is, again, they're not new people. They're there. They're there in the Egyptian New Kingdom. But the way of doing business, even the nautical technology, the ships, it's a different world, radically different world. And I think what's happening is a massive economic transformation over 200 or 300 years. And climate change, drought specifically, is involved there. It definitely forces people to respond to a different kind of stress, So this is a really complicated, fascinating period. We simplify it by saying it's a collapse and everything goes away. for 200 years, and then poof, things emerge. Actually, there's not really a hiatus. There's these people, they're still there. It's just we have a hard time seeing it. And we see some things like the sea peoples are depicted in the Egyptian royal text. Even they're drawn, these people on ships, and it's true they're soldiers, men with pointy sticks, but women and children too, on the ships that the Egyptian pharaohs, Ramses III in particular, at his funerary monument at Medina Habu, show us. And this is sort of again, the way it's depicted is it looks like an event. It looks like an invasion in a particular year, and Ramses is heroically repelling them. But it's actually a process over many years, indeed. And there's migration, perhaps partly drought induced. It's not easy to manage people from the outside in an age without passport control and things. It's just the nature of the ancient world that movement of people is difficult from the point of view of a state to control, which states like to do. Anyway, I think the Bronze Age collapse doesn't do it justice. This is a fascinating period of economic transformation, and we see the early Iron Age. It is a radically different world. Although Egypt stays in the Bronze Age for centuries longer than other places do for various reasons. Sources of metal, which maybe we can talk about a little bit, but sources of metal are a major driver of exchange patterns, trade, economic life in the ancient world from the beginning. Where does copper come from? Where does tin come from, more importantly, to make bronze? And that's critical in the Bronze Age. And then, what are the iron sources? For example, some places have it and can control the production of that metal. Other places, like Egypt, don't have iron, so you have to trade for it, which changes the game a bit. Anyway, and by the way, the Iron Age also has radically transforms places like China. It's also different. So it's not some it's partly cultural, I guess, how people respond to the change. But this is a worldwide phenomenon. This first millennium BC changes, which is really rather interesting. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to a complicated question.
Yeah, you said a lot there, and we'll get to a lot of what you said. But I'm just curious about something else you might disagree with slightly. So let's just talk about the axial age for a second. I know there's a term that's coined for a period of kind of intellectual development. So would you agree that Egypt was a axial age outlier, or would you take issue with that statement?
Yeah, the way I think axial age is a really interesting concept. The problem is, if you believe, the original expression of it, that it's the pivot point is around 500 BC or so. The exact chronology doesn't work. If you say the axial age is something between 800 and 200 BC, which is the Iron Age, then fine. I would say the axial age is the Iron Age, more or less. Then I'm good, because I think there are massive changes there in religion and everywhere else, most places in the world. Egypt's lagged. If you say it's like a religious, it's fundamentally a change in the relationship between politics and religion, which again is often stressed in the early literature. I would say Egypt actually might have had transformed earlier than most places. It's precocious. So, and we look at the Ramessid period in the New Kingdom, 1200 BC or so. Things change radically, and actually beginning with the so-called heretic king, the so-called first monotheist Akhenaten. It's not monotheism at all. But what Akhenaten is doing at the end of the 18th dynasty in the New Kingdom, in the 1300s, is trying to radically transform the relationship between political power, the ruler, and religion. And so if you think that's the crux of this transformation, then I would say Egypt very much is part of this phenomenon, but it's earlier. It's several hundred years earlier than other places.
What about things like philosophical insight? Obviously, it's associated with Greece, famously.
Right.
Does that not define the axial age idea as well?
It could.
And does that come into Egypt at all?
Yeah. I would say you look at the hymns to the Aten that are composed by Akhenaten himself or somebody who was a very good writer. Those written texts are a political statement of kingship, very very much so. So I mean, it's experimental. The other priesthoods resisted it, of course, and there's private religious changes too, and afterwards in the Ramesside period. It's called the Age of Personal Piety by some scholars. So there are some changes. It's different. I mean, again, I would broaden it out from the original expression. That well, you get Greek philosophers, and you get Chinese philosophers, and you get the Old Testament prophets, and this is the classic evidence of this transformation of religion and politics. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I would just broaden it out and say we can see similar things happening or beginning to happen anyway. They may have been suppressed in Egypt, given how kingship and priesthoods work there. But I think you have inklings of it in Egypt much earlier. So I would broaden it out, and the chronology again is often like 500 BC or so, and I would say I would do it earlier, and then we're talking again. It's a matter of social processes over many centuries. It's not some kind of sudden thing, which is sometimes how it's thought
Yeah,
about. And,
so kind of a theme in what you're saying so far is that like sometimes putting these names on things can oversimplify it maybe, and there's obviously a lot more nuance, and things happen at different
yeah,
times in different places. Is that
yeah.
kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, yes. I think we have to look at processes, which are damn hard to do in ancient evidence, by the way. But we're looking at ancient societies. This is the cool part about doing ancient history. These are societies. They're complex, not as complex as modern ones. Okay, fair enough. Population is much less, and so on. But we're still looking at human societies that are hierarchical and that are complex, and a lot of ideas and a lot of exchange patterns happening. And again, the transformations that are in the Axial Age, the original work, as well. China is transforming as the ancient Near East and the Greek world, and they're not connected. So therefore, there's like something in the air that's kind of driving this. And I would say
Yeah,
again, no,
I
I
read
mean,
that.
yeah, but first of all, they are connected
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah,
to
more
some
interconnected than
extent.
we realize maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
kind of, and one of the connections is the great Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, on the periphery of which are all these places that are so-called transforming, and then the Persian Empire goes away eventually. That's now we're at Alexander the Great times, which is kind of why I like to go down to 200 BC. I mean, Alexander's in the 330s BC. But I mean, you could argue that in part maybe some of this is in reaction to that imperial pressure. Again, I'm wildly speculating just to get on the table the fact that the explanations are probably really complicated, and they're not easy to see in the kind of evidence we have. So I go back to the Axial Age or anything else, the First Intermediate Period, any of these labels. What are we trying to explain?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
big historical question, always.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. So I'm just going to go on a slight segue for a second. So
Yeah,
you mentioned complexity there, and I know you collaborated on a study that looked at complexity and maybe how it arises similarly in different, I suppose, regions or cultures over time. So could you just talk a little bit about what you did there with that paper you collaborated on, and like what is social complexity and what are the overlaps between different places and how they become
yeah.
complex?
Oh
It was
God, I mean that's
quantitative. It was using a quantitative
yeah.
approach to
No,
answer
this
a
is
big historical
yeah,
question.
yeah. I mean, this is Peter Turchin's project, who was at University of Connecticut. He's retired now. He's mainly in Vienna, still working on complexity, and what's called structural demographic theory, which is something he's pioneered. Which we don't have time to explain too much, but your listeners can look it up. It is a
Yeah,
highly quantified. Essentially, I think it's very admirable. Historians don't like Peter Turchin's approach because it's highly quantified, and he's trying to get at a kernel of what drives change. But the thing is, I think it's really interesting, right or wrong. I think it's legitimate to do this, and I think he's yielded some interesting results at this kind of macro comparison. So he's looking at human society. We tried to. I worked on Egypt with him, just trying to code Egypt over time across 4,000 variables. Never been done before, and a lot of the variables are blank because we don't have evidence. But those blanks are really interesting. And what the project did fundamentally for me as an historian is have him. He forced me to fill out answers to 4,000 variables. Like, what do we know about what's the largest city in Old Kingdom Egypt? What's the second largest city in Old Kingdom Egypt? What was the nature of the legal system? Is there a written code in the Old Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom, or so on and so forth? And it's a lot of questions that I didn't automatically know the answers to. It forced me to think and look things up and go, what actually do we know about this at a particular cross section of a century, century by century. So he's this whole project, and it's called the Seshat Project, which is the ancient Egyptian goddess of writing and knowledge, which is sort of nice. It's the data's available. The data's available. It's online, and I just think, he's interested in, when do you get like really big imperial gods, and what's the connection between that and the size of states, and how does the relationship between political and economic power and the size of a state. What are the connections, let's say? So this is historical dynamics. He would call it rise and fall of states. What's driving expansion? What's driving contraction? In a very sophisticated way, like no single answer. All of that is human history in a nutshell. You can disagree with it, which is good if you disagree with it. Like, why do you disagree with it? What do you object to? Are you objecting to simplification or whatever? The other great thing about it is it's explicitly a comparative project. So
Yeah,
you see differences between societies.
Yeah, just jump in there for a second. So, from your own intuition, or maybe from what he would say, like, what factors really drive complexity, or what makes a civilization maybe more advanced or more complex? Like, is it money or writing, or is it like the institutions and the capacity of the institutions, or population, or maybe urbanization?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main drivers, I think, in Peter's view is military power, military technology, and size of states are directly related to the ability of a state to project military power. Plain and simple. Like, how do you do that? And so, there's also the nature of social hierarchy. Which is where this demographic theory comes in, because this is driving historical change, essentially. Yeah. So it's the size of state, it's the number of people that are living in it, for example, the level of technology, and so on. I mean, there are many factors here that we can't simplify into one thing. But then also, how do you coordinate the society? And this is where religion comes in. How do you run a society of many millions of people?
That's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there are a million questions follow from that. But once you see a society coded over time, like, here's what we know in these categories over several thousand years, it's really it's rather interesting, I think, and it shows you not only what we know, but more importantly, what we don't know.
Yeah. Okay, so let's zone in a little bit more on the Hellenistic period, because obviously that's what you specialize in.
Okay.
Let's talk about what it was, where we're talking about here exactly, and then let's get to the Ptolemies as well, and who the Ptolemies were, and how they came to power.
Okay. Wow. Fast shift forward to the 4th century BC, which is a really interesting period of Mediterranean history. The Peloponnesian War comes to an end in 404 BC, this great war in the Greek world between Athens and its allies against Sparta and its allies, land versus naval power, and so on. Go read Thucydides. That's the account. It's devastating in the Greek world in many ways, demographically, economically, and so on. It has a significant impact. And then we have, in the wake of that, we have several centers in the Greek world that dominate for a decade at a time. The city of Thebes, the city of Corinth, Athens for a little bit. which is kind of, in a way, it's the nature of Greek civilization, a world of 1,000 city-states, and they're competitive with each other, which is one of the defining features of Greek history, which is important and interesting. Anyway, in the 4th century BC, on the periphery of all these Greek city-states, who not involved in the Peloponnesian War directly, is Macedon. And Philip II, the great reformer, the great shaper of Macedonian military power, and then his son Alexander the Great, who eventually take over political military control of the Greek world. They are a dominant military power, cavalry in particular, and with high tech for the time military weaponry, but also ways of deploying men on the battlefield. And they are a superior fighting force. And so on the periphery of the Greek world, this military power arises and dominates the Greek world. And goes on for various reasons, whether compelled to or because they could. We debate all the issues there about why Philip initially, then Alexander. And some people in the Greek world, especially Athens, said, actually, we're not the enemy. It's the Persian Empire who burned the Parthenon at the beginning of the 5th century in the Greco-Persian Wars. They're the enemy. Anyway, Alexander takes his army into the Persian Empire, defeats the Persian Empire after a few battles. But I mean, it's an amazing military campaign for a decade, which is extraordinary, really extraordinary for the ancient world. Which is why even Roman generals, centuries later, look back to Alexander as unequaled in imperial military conquest.
It's so interesting because, like, I guess before I started reading up on this, really, maybe a couple years ago, like when I was growing up, I always thought that Rome was obviously the great kind of expansionist empire, and like the Greeks weren't like militarized in that way. I don't know why I had that in my head, but obviously, like, and I didn't actually associate Alexander with the Greeks as much maybe as I should have. But he was actually taught by Plato, I think, and
Aristotle.
Like,
Aristotle.
Aristotle, was it? Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Now, what made him so? I suppose what made him such a brilliant general and a brilliant war leader as well?
Oh God! Now we get into psychohistory, and we have to read sources like Plutarch, who's our main source of Alexander's life, who's writing in the 2nd century AD. 5 centuries after his life, and it's all by that point it's all myth. But I mean, you can draw some basic conclusions. Philip also was an incredible military strategist. He managed to harness the natural power of Macedon, which is rich in natural resources, in timber resources, in agriculture, and so on. This is a very prosperous place that was not directly involved in the destructive Peloponnesian War. And the story goes that Philip, when he's a young man, he's a captive in Thebes. There were wars up there, and this is how Greeks sort of settled disputes. Is the losing side sends some number of elites as hostage to guarantee a treaty. And anyway, Philip, as a young man, finds himself in Thebes, which was at the time the military power in the Greek world, quite advanced in weaponry and so on. And eventually, he goes back to Macedon, takes over the throne. And all of a sudden, we have Macedon being a military power. So historians tend to connect Philip's experience in Thebes, at the time of the power in the Greek world, and he learns lessons as a young man and converts this rough civilization into this a military powerhouse by fighting wars in the surrounding area of Macedon initially, against all these tribes on pretty rough terrain. This is a mountainous part of the Greek world, and eventually, turns sights on southern Greece, the Greek city-state world. So Philip is underestimated often as something of a genius, and Alexander benefited from that. Whether he was behind Philip's murder or not, somebody was who benefited from Philip's demise. Maybe Alexander's mother, Olympias. But anyway, whatever that murder at the wedding was about, Alexander inherits Macedonian military power, and it's already kind of heading in the direction of going toward the Persian Empire and avenging the Greek world for all the insults that it experienced earlier. And Alexander, he's a young man, but he must have been extraordinarily charismatic. I mean, this is what Plutarch tells us. Even his voice was particularly loud. Who knows if that's true, but in the ancient world, a military commander probably had to be heard, and so it makes sense that he had a pretty good voice.
There's
And he
no
was quite
radios or
charismatic.
drones or smartphones. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And his looks, his hair famously was particularly manicured in a way that he must have been quite charismatic. The men followed him for a long time until they started to revolt after getting tired of years of war. But he must have been a great military leader, and depicted at the head of the army, taking a lot of risks on campaign. So I think he was probably a classic, very good military leader, and strategist, and quite successful against the Persian Empire, which was not as powerful
Okay.
as the Greeks initially feared, I guess. Anyway, so
Yeah. Yeah.
the campaigns have significant impact all over the place, for a long period of time, and in the Near East, but in the Greek world, maybe even all the way to China. Eventually, this idea of this massive military power going through the Persian Empire, and all the way out to the Indus River Valley, which is extraordinary. All these military campaigns ultimately create what we call the Hellenistic world. Alexander dies suddenly at Babylon after coming back from the Indus River Valley, and this disastrous march through the Gadrosian Desert with his men, where many men died without water. So Alexander dies for whatever reason. Again, a bit of a mystery. And his generals ultimately carve up the military conquest that he created, the Persian Empire and the Greek world among them. And they form kingdoms, which is what we call the Hellenistic world, from the death of
So
Alexander
he
the
was the
Great.
architect. So Alexander
Yeah,
was essentially the architect of the Hellenistic period.
yeah.
That
He
was
walked
him.
through it. He walked through the
Okay.
Near East. He walked through Egypt, and so there's a huge legacy there. That's I mean, he founded Alexandria. So really, architect of the Hellenistic world is probably the right phrase. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, and when the Ptolemies came to power in Egypt, like,
Yeah.
how did they change Egypt? Like, did they overturn the original Egyptian institutions? Did they change life in Egypt? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great. So the Ptolemies are fascinating. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's boyhood friends, also taught by Aristotle. It's hard to imagine the impact of that, but you would think it was considerable if they were, unless they were just typical young boys who paid no attention to one of the great geniuses in human history. But I like to think they paid a bit of attention to what Aristotle was teaching them. So Ptolemy was, a contemporary, a boyhood friend, very close to Alexander. He writes the history of the campaigns, which is lost to us. If I want to conjure anything from the ancient world, it would be Ptolemy's history of the campaigns. My goodness, what a valuable text that would be. But he is
How do we know he
assigned.
wrote it? Like,
No,
how do we know? Like, are we sure it
because it's a
exists?
sort. Yeah, no, it's a sort. So the history of the campaigns we have is written by Arrian, again a Roman period source, but he mentions who he's reading, and Ptolemy's one of them. So
Oh, okay.
we know it. He wrote such a thing. Oh God, it'd be nice to have.
Wow. Yeah.
Anyway, so
Do
Ptolemy
you think it's
gets
possible?
assigned.
Do you think
Oh
it's
my God,
redeemable in any way? Do you
no,
think it's redeemable? No.
no,
It's gone
no.
forever. That's unfortunate, isn't it? Yeah.
Probably, yeah, for whatever reason. I mean, it wasn't copied. I mean, if it's just a single text, well, but Arian had it. I mean, I mean, it existed, and maybe it's it's underneath some medieval manuscript in a monastery in Europe somewhere. But listen,
Hopefully.
great historical novel there. So whoever writes that, please acknowledge me and send me 10%. I mean,
Yeah, it's a good idea.
we can speculate, but I mean, Ptolemy was really a smart man. He's one of the only. He might be the only of these successors of Alexander who dies in his bed at an old age. Most of Alexander's the generals who formed these states after Alexander dies, most of them die in battle or are murdered. Um, Ptolemy dies an old man in his bed. Okay, that's all you need to know. I mean, the guy was an operator and a real survivor, extremely savvy. He gets assigned Egypt as in the initial carve out of the Persian Empire. These generals, the successors in the Near East and Egypt, they're just governors of Persian province. They're satraps. And that's what Ptolemy is initially. He's just a satrap of Egypt, but he goes from there to converting it into one of the wealthiest and most successful kingdoms of the last 3 centuries BC. Forms a dynasty, and uses Egypt. I mean, Egypt's a great place, natural borders. When the Nile's flooding well, it's among the richest places on earth for agricultural wealth, which is the basis of all wealth. It's a good location for trade, for transit trade. It has this amazing natural double harbor of Alexandria, and so on. So Ptolemy, and it has thousands of years of kingship tradition and temples and priesthoods. So it's an ongoing system that works reasonably well. And Ptolemy just takes it over. I always teach my students that this is exactly like a corporate takeover. Um, if you're Apple Computer and you're buying some famous company, whatever, you're going to take over what works in that company. You're not going to necessarily change the brand name or change much. You want to keep it going. Basically, it's like a corporate takeover. You want to keep that thing you acquire going the way it was, and you might change things that don't work particularly well for you, but you're going to keep things going that work. And ancient Egypt and ancient Egyptian kingship and temples and priesthoods and the Nile flood and the grain that's produced, all that is really good. And so there's no reason to change that. So what Ptolemy does is sort of adapt to that. Whether it's Ptolemy or his son Ptolemy II, we can debate. Most of the evidence is Ptolemy II's reign, where we get this new Ptolemaic economic system. You get the tax system, you get the legal system, making adjustments for the Greek population in Egypt, for this huge city of Alexandria that's growing. You need people who at least write Greek, if not speak and write Greek, to run the administration, and that's an issue that was solved, kind of, by having Egyptian scribes and scribal families learn enough Greek to function. All that takes time, and over time there are changes and adjustments to the system. But essentially, Ptolemy, being, I think, fairly brilliant, knows what's there. He has Egyptian advisors, and he knows what works, what doesn't work, how to control the tax system. How to extract grain and move it around in effective ways. All the while building 2 Greek cities in Egypt, Alexandria and in the south, Ptolemais, as the southern administrative center for this new dynasty. So there are significant tweaks. The Greek language is one. The economy changes significantly, including coins being introduced.
What about coinage? As I would
Yeah.
say that. So was there coins in Egypt beforehand, and like were they used to a greater extent after the Ptolemies came?
Yeah, I mean, there's some coinage. There's some Persian coinage. There's some Athenian fake silver coinage in the Persian period, because Athenian silver coinage was kind of a standard coin in the Mediterranean. But coinage in Egypt itself was new with the Ptolemies. Ptolemy the First founds a mint at Alexandria, and eventually introduces coinage into the economic system. That's new, along with banks, both of which are probably coming out of the Athenian tradition, because that's sort of the gold standard, no pun intended, of Greek world economy. So eventually these Greek institutions come into Egypt as part of the Ptolemaic economy.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be careful here now when I'm talking about ancient economies because I don't want to use like put modern or superimpose modern words on
Yeah.
the ancient period. But can I just ask, like, a lot of people say that the Egyptian economy or the economies in the Near East were command economies, or maybe they were somewhat like despotic and there's no
Yeah.
markets and things like that. Would you agree with that, or would you push back?
No, I definitely push back pretty hard. Yeah, this is kind of the cartoon
Tell me
version.
more.
Yeah, it's a cartoon version of, it goes back to early days, understanding economic life in the ancient world. It certainly is in Moses Finley, the standard account, brilliant account of the ancient economy, and he wanted to draw a contrast between the classical world and the Eastern Mediterranean around things like how temples work, and conceptions of economy, and everything in the Near East and Egypt were palace economies. Again, think of the Mycenaean palaces or earlier Egyptian things controlled by a king, through temples, but it is kind of a centralized command economy, and just things are taxed and stored and moved around at the will of the king. I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's sort of the and I would say no to that. I mean, that is part of how economies work for particular reasons, of how a river valley like Egypt, how production works, how it's organized, how it's coordinated, or not. It's typically decentralized. Temples play an important role, as managers of local land, local irrigation conditions, and so on. Yeah. On top of that is a king who's sort of ideologically the center of the state. But that's a different thing than saying the king controls the entire economy top down. That's kind of
So,
the image of this,
so
and
what do we
that
know?
is not how it
What do
works.
we what do you know about like private activity? Like, as in, how do they estimate the value of a good? Because obviously they probably didn't have standardized prices. And do we know if there was like an element of private economic activity as well, not
Yeah, there's
just
huge.
like
Yeah, yeah.
centralized?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, there's huge private activity that's underestimated. I mean, I would say the classic reading on this still is Barry Kemp, in his book Ancient Egypt: Anatomy of a Civilization. And he has a chapter there called "The Birth of Economic Man," which I think is a brilliant account of the traditional pharaonic ancient Egyptian economy. And there you can see clearly, just in the material culture and the archaeology that Barry Kemp did for decades, in the Nile River Valley, that there's a considerable private demand around funerary goods, for example, and around around grain supply, around wages, salaries, and not coinage, but grain is a standard medium of exchange. Grain is an important form of money, in ancient Egypt, against which things are exchanged. A kind of a barter economy, which is a typical rural aspect of economic life in Egypt, all the way, I'm sure, through the Ptolemies, and beyond, even now to some extent. It's a traditional form of households exchanging goods at a very local level, at a micro level. Not always easy to see in our evidence, but it's definitely there. And so it's not just the king controlling everything and moving things around. To some extent, there is, but if you look at private tombs, private burials, um, funerary priests performing rituals for private people. Now, these are not peasant farmers, which is another issue we should try to think about, although it's not easy to do. But there is a kind of a middling class of priesthoods, and families, that we know something about, that are very much in the economic world. And there's private demand of funerary goods, of jewelry, of ritual things, all over the place, that in a household people would need, pottery, cooking utensils, mirrors, and hairpins for women that we see listed in marriage contracts. So if you can start cataloging the amount of private demand for goods that there were, we get a sense of local economies, not just the king commanding things, let's say, if that makes sense. I'm hearing,
Yeah, and how did you?
is that water, by the
Yeah.
way? I don't know if that's being
Oh,
recorded. Okay.
are you getting? No, no, it's. Are you getting from my side? Because
Yeah.
I can. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's actually the sea. So the sea is. I can't do anything about that. So like, the apartment's right next to the water. So that's
Oh,
probably what it is.
fantastic. Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
That's,
So yeah, I'm
that's,
actually right on the coast
oh,
in
fantastic. Oh
in
my
East
God. That's
Cork.
great.
So yeah, yeah, yeah.
Nice.
No, it's a
Okay.
nice
Sorry.
view. So no, no, you're good. Okay, so like I know you said in your book that like pre-modern economies didn't, or definitely in Egypt, there was no word for profit. So like, how do they work out how much something was worth or how much they're going to pay for something? Like, how do they do you have any idea of how they thought through that process? And
Okay.
also,
Yeah.
just yeah,
Yeah. 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 I mean, well,
is
my
that a
God.
tricky question?
It's very tricky.
It's,
I mean, they did have a word for profit. I think it's hu in ancient Egyptian, which means something like excess or something. So, these some of these abstract concepts that Moses Finley was keen to write out of ancient economies on the basis of philology, on the basis of vocabulary. No, but we have private loans we have interest. They had a word for interest,
yeah,
and
okay,
there,
well,
there, 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 there were private loans, and they're typically 50%. So that's easy to calculate. And so that maybe that's a math problem, but in ancient Egypt, but there's certainly loans, there's exchanges, there's famously a lot of economic activity, household economic activity in the town of the tomb builders of the Pharaohs, this place called Deir el Medina in Western Thebes during the New Kingdom. And we have 100,000 texts that come from that town, and we know a lot about what
like
happens. We know a
like
lot about
they
what
like
happens
so
there.
you're referring to like papyri sources or like receipts and contracts and stuff like that with
Yeah,
law
they're
like
they're on they're on ostraca. They're called ostraca. They're stone flakes, which is one of the byproducts of digging tombs into the living rock in Western Thebes. The Valley of the Kings. The byproduct of digging are these big shards of limestone, and it's a beautiful writing material. There are some papyri from that site, but mainly what we have are these things called ostraca. They're lists, they're receipts, there are transactions, there's legal disputes, there's a lot of gossip, there's drawings. I mean, this was a special community. These are some of the greatest artists of the ancient world. And if you don't believe me, just go look at the Valley of the Kings and the royal tombs. Um, even their private tombs, which are also preserved, they are extraordinary pieces of art. These were master craftsmen, highly trained, some of them literate. So it's fair to say this is not a typical Egyptian village. This was a company town employing some of the greatest artists of the ancient world. So,
right.
but there, I mean, we have a pretty good idea of private economic life, for example. So, there is a sophisticated economy. There's a well-developed concept of money, of exchange, lots of receipts, people keeping track of who owes what, who owes whom
That's
what.
incredible.
I should say. Yeah. So, the more we think about it, and of course, there are these extraordinary letters in New York, the Hekanakta letters, which are 2000 BC, Middle Kingdom letters of a father back to his household at a time of great stress, of now flood failure, it looks like. And he's writing home a list of orders of how to survive, what the economic strategy of the household is, what kind of land to rent where, what kind of prices to pay for renting land. It's extraordinarily detailed. And then a household budget, um, which
Wow.
is striking to a lot of economic historians. Like, none of this rational economic behavior exists until much later in history. No, no, this is Middle Bronze Age. It's 2000 BC. It can't be unique. The problem is the evidence is unique, though. These letters, they are some of the most significant texts in economic history. They are really detailed. It's a household of 19 people, including domestic servants, including divorced wife who's still living in the household, and new young wife, which caught Agatha Christie's attention when these texts were first discovered and translated in the 1920s, I think. She ends up writing "Death Comes as the End," inspired by these texts. So it's really interesting. These are And no one ever visits these things. Every time I go into the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, I always go to these texts, and there's no one there. It's in a quiet corner of the museum. People want to go see mummies, or maybe the Temple of Dender, but these letters are extraordinary. The frustrating thing is there's nothing like them in the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, I mean, there's, I'm being a little bit dramatic. There's bits and pieces of such evidence in the Near East too. But in Egypt, there's nothing like them until the Ptolemaic period in the 3rd century BC.
Okay.
Wow. That level of detail, and again, it could not have been unique. It shows us a mentality of a intellectual world of thinking through economics, which is running a household. That's the Greek term oikonomia is household management. That's what economy is. Here it is in 2000 BC in every detail you can possibly think about.
Yeah, so I think I remember from your book that. Yeah, I think I remember from your book that you actually said that households are like the backbone of maybe ancient economies, or maybe in Egypt. Could you just talk about like what do we mean by a household here? Like, is that like, does that mean like a nuclear family? Does it mean like maybe multiple generations living together? Do we have an idea of what the household actually was?
Yeah, well, I mean, if Hakanakta is typical, the households in Egypt were huge. It's not surprising in a pre-modern economy that households are large, a lot of kids, because that's wealth, that is your labor source, so nuclear family, the way we think of it, is much later in European history, I guess. This is a pre-modern household, complete with domestic servants. So this is some sort of middling class person. Hakanakta was a funerary priest, among other things. So he's somewhere in the middle of the social structure, nothing high level. Whether he was literate or had someone compose these things, we don't know. They were found in Thebes, by the way, in a tomb, which is where he was. And so they apparently were never sent, which is also intriguing.
Do we know like how things like marriages worked? Do we know like, was there like a proper ceremony? Was there any documents supported? And like, do we know if people were monogamous and like, was it just one partner for life, or was it a little bit messier than that?
Yeah, no, it's messier than that. No,
I thought so.
I mean, yeah, typically humans.
Yeah.
Typically there wouldn't be a ceremony. I mean, typically a wife would move into the husband's household, and that would be it. We do have marriage contracts later. These are elite, and these are around property and around guaranteeing children of the marriage would inherit husbands as well as the wife's property. So it's about property descent, really. But typically, I think marriage would not be written, would not be a ceremony, as far as we know. I mean, it may have been celebrated in the family, a nice dinner if you could afford it, or so. But and divorce was equally simple. A divorce looks pretty modern by our standards. It was no fault divorce. A woman could leave on the marriage anytime she wants. And the marriage contracts that we have later in the first millennium BC, we have a couple hundred, I think, marriage contracts, which they're interesting texts. But it says there, if we divorce, whether because I don't love you anymore or you don't love me anymore, that's no problem. And the woman has her property guaranteed. She has kind of an income afterwards. So it protects the woman, and any property she brings in to the marital household, she gets back, or the equivalent value. And these marriage contracts list what she's bringing in: her mirrors, her earrings, her cooking utensils, and it gives a value of these things. It may be notional value, but she's expecting that equivalent value back, just in case the husband hawks the cooking utensils. So these are really interesting in terms of the legal history and the history of women. Those marriage contracts we have from later Egyptian history are significant. But in most cases, marriage would have been pretty, in a peasant household, let's say, about which we know not a lot, unfortunately. It would have been pretty straightforward, I think, and possibly even arranged between households in a village.
Okay, interesting. I know you've written about justice as well in Egypt in the Ptolemaic period and possibly earlier.
Yeah.
would you agree that maybe Egyptian ideas of justice were a little bit more advanced than we initially thought?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, the legal system is how everything, how the society goes around. I mean, that is kind of the mirror of a society, is what the conceptions of law, justice, equity, and so on are. And yeah, I mean, the cool thing about Egypt, again, just to nuance this idea of a highly despotic pharaoh
Mm,
controlling everything. The counterweight to that is this Egyptian concept of ma'at, which is translated justice, law, order, um, different ways. It is a society in balance, and in fact, the Egyptian conception of weighing of the heart, that is weighing of all your deeds in the afterlife against the feather of justice, that is what determines your afterlife. This is a moral concept. I mean, I think in Britain, we certainly in England, in the U.S. have this idea of justice, until recently anyway, of a blind lady with a scale. That is an ancient Egyptian symbol of a society in balance, and that balance is caused by this order of a society is the sense of law, the sense that everyone's going to be treated a particular way. And that concept of ma'at, this is what the priests guarantee that the kings will adhere to, that even the king had to adhere to this concept. Now, did every king do? No, highly unlikely. But that concept is there, that keeps society in order, that a good king will do the following, will guarantee order and justice, and allow anyone, even a peasant farmer, in theory again, to petition the state for any kind of private wrong, that the king was the guarantor of the legal system of society, of a society in balance. Um, and that balance is also seen in the Nile flood every year, too. That's the sense of order, that the Nile floods regularly about 70% of the time. And there is some sense of order. There's that officials won't abuse peasants in tax collection or in any other context. Again, that probably happened, but there is this moral conception that the state operates within, and that people live their lives by also, and ultimately you're judged in the afterlife, around this concept. So I think Jan Assmann, the great German Egyptologist, calls this connective justice, this concept of ma'at, for good reason, because it connects the society from the king, from the gods to the king, to officials, to every peasant farmer in the Nile River Valley. That's the thread that runs through Egyptian history all the way through, this concept. And we underestimate its importance, as kind of the social glue, of the society.
Was this independent of religion, or was it very much like influenced by religious traditions at the time?
Yeah,
Was justice driven or morality driven by religious beliefs?
yeah, yeah. It's part of the social system, and it's no accident that the courts, that we have trials. There are courts. Typically, an Egyptian court, a trial would be held in front of the temple gates, uh, for good reason. That it is, that the judgment of the dead is, when you die, you're judged before all the gods of Egypt in this hall of justice. So too in this world, that you are judged in front of all the gods, even when you have to swear an oath that you're telling the truth, which is the Egyptian concept that goes very far back. You're doing that in front of all the gods of Egypt. So that morality, that sense of, what's the word, of um, yeah, but you're telling the truth. Simple as that. You're doing that in front of not only your town, your village, but all the gods of Egypt. So it does reinforce the entire system. It's part and parcel of the justice system.
Okay, and do we know if if when the I suppose did the Greek influence change like religion, or did Egyptians stick with their old gods?
Oh my goodness, I think there's a lot of changes once the Ptolemies are running Egypt. No, the Egyptian religion, yeah, it's there's two religions. There's the state religion, which are the temples, which is the connection between gods, the king, society, and all these the big rituals with the gods in these large temples throughout Egypt. And there's also private belief system, which is the household system, what people actually believe. They're two different levels
Okay.
of belief.
I didn't know
Um,
that. So is that like
yeah,
superstition, like, or like maybe local customs or beliefs, as in there wasn't one centralized religion like Christianity. It was a little bit different. Well, I guess
right.
Christianity is not necessarily centralized either.
No,
So
yeah, no. I mean, if we think of a temple in Egypt as a kind of a church, we'd be far off the mark.
okay, okay,
It's not.
fascinating.
It's a highly specialized place of religious practice of priests, in which no one else took part. The king could see the inner sanctum where the statue of the god dwelt, where the spirit, a sense of the god dwelled. No one could see that. The high priest and the king. That'd be it. It's highly exclusive. There are big festivals every year in the big temples that everyone could participate in, to some extent. But that is really like the state practice. And then there's
Okay,
the private beliefs are around things that you might think are really important. The worries of sickness, the great worries of childbirth for women, which is an extraordinarily dangerous thing. Um,
yeah,
and a lot of women died in childbirth in ancient Egypt. It was very
yeah,
common. So, there's good reason why this was really scary. And so there's kind of, I mean, we call it magic. It really is part of the private belief system to protect a woman at childbirth, to protect against snake bites or scorpion bites, to protect against plague or other kind of disease. Even love potions to catch a girl. We have these things. I mean, that is the realm of private belief, what people actually cared about, not these state gods who were kind of I think remote in most people's living experience, except for these big festivals that the temples would have every year. Those are, that was in the realm of the public, and participation to some extent of
yeah, yeah.
everybody.
We kind of have it. So I'm just thinking, in Ireland, a lot of people like pray to their dead loved ones for maybe help with certain situations.
Yes.
But again, I don't think that's actually in Catholic Church teaching. So yeah, people kind
Okay.
of I guess go
Yeah.
their own way a little bit with things.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
so that's
That's
interesting.
right.
Yeah, human nature doesn't change that much. Okay, just
No.
to zoom out a little bit,
No.
like just to zoom out a little bit and take maybe a bigger picture question, was something like per capita economic growth actually possible in the ancient world, or was it very limited by demographic factors
Ah,
like small populations and obviously disease? Or do you think there
yeah.
was growth over time, or some improvement in living standards, or some improvement in capacity to acquire wealth over time?
Yes. Yeah. So I forget if I say this in the open sea or not, but it's something I believe that. And here, Moses Finley, I would agree with, even though I disagree with a lot of what he said. That if the modern economics concern about real growth, that is growth above population increase, that people are getting better off. That's like real growth. Um, that's a modern economic obsession. And we do it, quarterly, which is even more absurd, I think. But, I mean, that is a modern economics concern. And I don't think it's a fair measure of pre-modern economies. There may have been some real growth. I think there probably was, even in the Roman Empire. It's been demonstrated. It's tiny though by modern economic standards. It's hard to see except in the aggregate over many centuries. So it's small
So
for
that could
reasons
be
of
something like
demography, for reasons of technology
so could
levels.
that be like population increasing or something over time? What would you how would you actually tell if
Yeah.
growth is happening even a little bit, even if it's on the margins? Like would it just be maybe an increase in urbanization or a bigger population?
Yeah, so it wouldn't be bigger population, because that wouldn't necessarily be real growth. It would be expansion. It would be static growth, and that happens a lot. Population increases and production increases to keep track of, to support the population. That happens all the time. The problem is in the ancient world that that's not sustainable over the long run. But yeah, you get responses, you get intensification um, in response to population growth in the ancient world everywhere. Um, the sustained real growth, that's the magic of modern economics, of the modern world, that we sustain 2 or 3%. It's not really sustainable in the long run, by the way. But um, we are obsessed with this labor productivity growth and technology driving things, driving us like skyward, of course. But no, I mean, the pre-modern world is not that, and the point is that should not be the standard against which we judge pre-modern economies, which is often the case. No, I mean, these are, if we look at Egypt and these 500-year stretches of centralized, reasonably stable life, that's what they cared about. That's what the pharaohs cared about, not growth, because that's not a concept, of course, that they thought about or cared about. They cared about stability. Now you can
Okay.
judge that harshly. Well, low levels of technology and nothing really changed. But again, there's tremendous change we can see, societal change, and there's even technological change. But the obsession with explaining growth in the pre-modern world is I mean, the reason that's important in economic theory is institutions. And while some institutions are better than others, the argument goes democracy is better than autocracy. We know that now. I think we still know that now. And
Democracy,
then we look
democracy is
back.
the worst form of all governments. I think was that Churchill. It's the least bad
Yes,
form, maybe.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, like find a better one.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah,
yeah, but again, I would nuance that. I would, I think autocracy versus democracy is a little bit stark of a contrast, for starters. I think there probably is real growth. You can see it maybe in improved living standards, maybe in looking at domestic archaeology, looking at, are households nicer, are they bigger over time, or things like that people tend to look at. It's tricky. That's a tricky thing to find, actually. But there are improvements in many places. I mean, I think the real test would come with the sciences that we might turn to shortly. And then we could, are people better off if we have mummies, if we have ancient bodies? We can start doing some sophisticated science now, and maybe eventually, in the aggregate, we can say, are people longer lived in the Ptolemaic period or the Roman period than they were in the New Kingdom? Is the diet better? Has health improved, or not? And it may not be the case, of course.
yeah,
But that's
So
that's that's really important. I mean, that's the quantified, really important metric that I think we're heading to,
yeah,
and we'll know.
yeah, I want to come to that. So I'm going to throw you out a big question. So, what's the importance of the sciences and the humanities working together to answer big questions? Because maybe we're missing out on some really valuable knowledge by not integrating these and maybe
Yeah.
dissolving the disciplinary boundaries. So, can you talk a little bit
Yes,
about why
indeed.
you think those boundaries should be dissolved, and how could we use
Nice.
scientific methods in history to answer big questions?
That's okay, Donna. Now you're speaking my language. Yes, I'm a proponent of dissolving disciplinary boundaries. I'm a little bit radical about it, but we have to, and
That's okay.
we're going there slowly. And I think some really smart people are doing it. So it's increasingly impossible to ignore sciences, and in particular these two fields: paleoclimatology, reconstructing past climates, which is essentially physics and chemistry applied to natural phenomena in the world, that we can start reconstructing temperature and precipitation patterns primarily, and paleogenomics, which is usually using ancient DNA in a very sophisticated way to look at not only diseases and pathogens, but even migration history. Both these sciences, these large sciences, are changing lots about what we know about the ancient world, um, about living conditions, about changes, about stresses, about human responses to stresses like climate change, whether it's a short-term Nile flood failure, or a 200-year drought. And we can see both those scales now in the scientific evidence we have. It's not. It's adding significant information We historians ignore it at their peril because it's coming. It's coming every week. There's new information that's really important, and historians and archaeologists have to embrace it, or scientists are going to start writing the history,
Yeah,
which
that's
to some
incredible.
extent they already are. And the thing is that the scientists and scientific data need historians. It's a different ontology. We work differently than scientists do, but together we can create a really interesting, rich, and dynamic picture of ancient societies. So we need to work together. There's no other way. We need each other. The historians give relevance and meaning to the scientific data, and the data is really challenging many things we thought we knew about the ancient world, but were either wrong or, in fact, we didn't know
Yeah, let's
things.
just zoom in on one of those, I suppose, areas of exploration there. So let's talk about volcanic activity and its role in climate change in the ancient world, and
Yeah,
the connection here with social tensions or maybe breakdown of social cohesion. So I know you've talked about this a bit.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the project I've been working on now for close to a decade with people around the world, including a really great group in Dublin led by Francis Ludlow at Trinity College. It's been a great project. And we're actually having a big meeting here at Yale University next week about kind of wrapping up and where do we go from here. So it's been an amazing many years now working with scientists on this basic phenomenon that we call volcanic forcing of the East African monsoon. Volcanic forcing means large volcanic eruptions, not all of them, but really large ones, which we can see evidence of in polar ice cores, because the sulfates that are the product of eruptions, they get injected into the stratosphere. They travel through the stratosphere hemispherically, and they get precipitated out onto polar ice and preserved in layers annually. That's the basic concept. We know not. We can see a lot about volcanic eruptive history in polar ice cores. It turns out that large eruptions not only reflects sunlight back into space, so it produces a cooling effect on the Earth's surface, but also changes atmospheric circulation patterns, which means it impacts the monsoonal rains around the world. And the Nile River is driven by the annual flood of the river by the East African monsoon. And so we can see connections, for example, between a really large volcanic eruption in Alaska and now flood failure. And the dating of these things are really specific now. And we can start, because we have a lot of text from the Ptolemaic period and the Roman period, we can start looking at patterns of eruptions and what we think are weakening flood conditions, sometimes no flood. And we can start seeing patterns year by year, at least decade by decade, and we can start then looking at societal responses. All of that is a bit it's controversial. It's we need more information. We need more grain prices to really look at the impact. We don't have many of them, and so it's we are being to some extent speculative once we look at the society on the ground. But in some cases, we see patterns that look pretty clear. And the Nile River is sensitive to these disruptions, and because they're annual, sorry, excuse me, large eruptions will impact the monsoon rains for a year or two, typically, although sometimes longer. We can start looking at the impacts of these events, these climate events. So this is not a 200-year drought. This is an annual or a couple years. In the case of the Okmuk eruption in 43 BC in Alaska, that has a severe impact on the Nile, we think, but also on the Mediterranean, even on the Roman world, where it gets colder and wetter in the Mediterranean and it gets dry in East Africa where the monsoon hits. So we can start seeing regional dynamics and the impacts of a single eruption. In the case of Okmuk, for a decade, it looks like, from the climate modeling that's been done. So we're using climate models. We're using climate proxy records, as they're called, like ice cores, looking at eruptions. In some cases, we can start to identify the particular eruption. The lab who identified Okmuk in 43 BC, the ice or the glass shards, the tephra in ice at that level was a great lab in Belfast, in Ireland. It's brilliant science that fingerprinted that particular volcano, and that's important because a particular volcano in a particular year we can actually have a very specific model response to. Very often we just know the volcano somewhere in the northern hemisphere. It's somewhere in the tropics like Indonesia, but not a specific volcano yet. But increasingly we can start fingerprinting, I hope, more specific volcanoes. So a specific location on Earth, which will give us more information about what we might expect in terms of the response
Yeah.
of those things.
Would that allow us to explore maybe how societies reacted to that in terms of
Yeah,
were there periods where society thrived or where there was maybe tension or rebellions? Like, could we
that's right.
possibly
Yeah.
eventually extrapolate out that data into maybe, I guess, forming maybe not conclusions, but at least hypotheses there?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Sorry to
Okay.
interrupt. Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're doing. Social instability, unrest. We've done a little bit of work on. Even because we have such rich written information, I wish our archaeology were better. We need to work on that. But the archaeology of Greco-Roman Egypt is not spectacular for various reasons. But there's some that we need to integrate into the story. But the written record, I mean, for example, we look at petitions to the state for redress. Um, does now flood failure, especially significant ones, 2 years or more, and we know historically we have great historical records from medieval Egypt, from Ottoman Egypt, and there we can really see the link between flood failure and societal distress. It's absolutely clear: famine, disease, unrest, very well documented, and it's highly likely that it exists earlier. I mean, why wouldn't it? Unless we're saying, ancient Egypt was just a much nicer society and everyone was happy and, didn't respond the same way. But, the population may have been a little bit lower, but not by much by Ptolemaic and Roman times compared to medieval Egypt. I mean, it's roughly the same. So, yeah, we can start looking at patterns. That's the thing, patterns of legal petitions, patterns of social unrest, patterns of, in some cases, we have grain prices. We can see that distress. We can see state responses. We can see fiscal responses. We can see new institutions around tax collecting as a response to distress of harvest weakness or failure. So we can start seeing the bottom line is we can start seeing, rather than a static description of ancient society, which is almost every textbook on ancient history, it's just a static description. We can actually see a dynamic society, a human society responding in real time to stress. That's kind of what we're trying to get, and that is a
Do you think?
different way of doing history.
Do you know? So I remember reading something, sorry, a couple of years ago now. Apparently, like historians were surveyed on the potential reasons for the fall of Rome, and I think there was over like 200. But
Yeah,
is there a good chance that maybe climate change or this kind of transient impact of volcanic activity should be considered a factor in why civilizations maybe decline,
yeah,
especially in ancient times?
yeah. Well, my book I just finished talks about this, and I would say, and I'm not the only one. There's other good work out there. Yes, there's no doubt that it's not the only explanation. Here, that's the thing with a complex society. You can never say climate change does X and it's a disaster, which is a lesson for the modern world too. It's never just climate change. It's 10 factors all at the same time. It's fiscal distress, it's harvest failure, it's social tensions, it's war. For example, it's tax increases in order to fight a war. It's movement of people and social tensions, and and then there's a now flood failure for 2 years, and that now we're talking serious distress. And so what we're trying to understand again is the complexity and not reduce things to climate change or a volcano does X. No, of course not. No, no. It's additional stress added at a time of particular stress that it just sort of it can tip a society over over the edge sometimes, and sometimes like a volcanic eruption. The Egyptians or the Romans did not know Alaska existed, and they knew Vesuvius was close by, and that's a problem if you live in the shadow of Vesuvius. But they did not know that a large volcano in Alaska could impact the global climate system for a decade, and drive monsoon weakness in East Africa and make the flood weaker. That's a shock. That's unexpected. It's a shock outside of their system, outside of their thinking. They had no idea what it was or what was driving it. It's a religious reason. It's some kind of weird portend of bad stuff's going to happen. They had no idea of how the natural climate system works. So that's also intriguing, I would say, that we can start now.
Do you
We can
think
start
if
seeing this.
do you think the more we understand about this, it might help us interpret the climate change we're going through at the moment,
Yeah,
and in terms of impact? Do you think this history will be valuable for informing the, I suppose, present moment concerns?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason climate is changing is a bit different now than these natural changes. I mean, a volcanic eruption or changes in El Nino cycles, or changes in solar output. The natural drivers of the climate system. Um, and we are now controversial, but it's the case that we are driving climate change these days. Our human activity, burning of fossil fuels, is a significant part of things. So, but nonetheless, the climate is always changing. This is what we hear, and I mean that's true. It changes naturally, and we're now a natural force in that. But there are some things that will surprise. A volcanic eruption is always a surprise. And I mean, if you look at the history of volcanic eruptions, now we have it reconstructed all the way through the Holocene, the last 12,000 years. We're living in a quiescent period of volcanic activity, even though you think, well, Iceland's erupting, but we haven't had a significant eruption that impacts Earth's climate since 1991 in Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. So we are actually
Yeah.
living in a quiescent period, the way the Roman Empire was in the first 2 centuries AD. There's only one eruption in the first 150 years of the Common Era.
Do you think
So it
do you think
was
that gave the
stable.
Romans a bit of a head start? Do you think it actually contributed to them expanding so much? The fact that
Well,
they were
it may
looking
have
at
been a
climate.
factor. It may have been a factor. It's
Okay, interesting.
hard to quantify, but it was certainly, it's called the Roman optimum. Um, but it's a worldwide phenomenon, and the Roman optimum essentially means no volcanic activity, which means it's a bit warmer than it had been in the Hellenistic period, because there are lots of eruptions in the last 3 centuries BC. So it's different. It's the climate system is stabler in the first couple centuries AD. Does that explain the Roman Empire? Well, no, but it doesn't hurt to have that kind of
Yeah.
stability. That kind of stability for agriculture is nice. And then, things start getting really bad again in the third century CE, with huge eruptions and a lot of instability and plague, and a lot of bad things happen to Rome. Again, we're talking over 3 centuries for the fall of Rome. It's not just climate, but the climate shocks, the plagues, the invasions. There's more than 200. There's more than 200 explanations for the fall of Rome now. That's true, and there's no single cause. It's many things on top of each
Yeah, it's like all
other.
these things correlate or interweave, and
Yeah,
like one of them is maybe the straw that broke the camel's back eventually.
well, it's
Uh,
possible. On the other hand, no empire goes on forever.
yeah, yeah.
So
So I'm going. I think we're a lot over time, so we're going to finish
oh
in a
my gosh.
second. But I just want to ask one or two. So a question related to maybe the U.S. at the moment. How are things
Oh,
in the U.S. universities? So we're talking about declining societies. I hope it doesn't
yeah.
apply to the U.S. or the West
Well,
for
I
that
think
matter. Hopefully not. But are things strange at the moment over there?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're living in weird times. I mean, I think you could argue that the American empire, whatever that is, which is a different kind of empire than before, that's probably in decline. I would say.
A
Is
lot of
that
people say it is.
yeah, it might well be. And is that sad? I don't know. I mean, what you worry about is instability in the world. And there's hegemonic powers rising in places like China, which seem pretty clear. And so, things will be changing and shifting. I think, what's happening in America now is we have really poor political leadership. It's deeply corrupt. Um, that is a symptom. It's not current president changing things. He's a symptom of uh, internal problems that we have to acknowledge and we have to face. We see them before. Again, I think Peter Turchin's work on this is quite interesting to think through. So these are symptoms, and we know them now. We know the historical dynamics. We can do something about them. It requires America, and it's happening. The American population is, I think, responding pretty well. We'll see how No King's Day goes on Saturday in the country. I think there'll be many millions of people on the street um, peacefully protesting. I think it's really problematic. I mean, universities. We are the scribes of modern society. The professors are the scribal class, so we're not particularly powerful. But of course, they're going after the scribal class. They're going after science, which is really sad because America has
Yeah.
led in science significantly so for a long time, and it's actually stupid to get rid of the strength. So
It's
we
self-defeating, yeah.
yeah, no, it is. It's totally ugly. It's really frustrating. I'm on one side of the debate for sure. It is currently deeply corrupt. It's obviously deeply corrupt. It's dangerous. It's weakening for corrupt reasons. It's so obvious to see. Everyone should be out on the streets, and democracy in the states may be strengthened as a result of this. That's what I hope. I'm optimistic that people will, start thinking for themselves and not relying on certain news sources, which people are in this social media world. It's reinforcing these societal processes which are already present, and they're always present in societies, and we have to be aware of them. That goes back to the founding of America, is to be aware of these forces and to counter them. That's the whole point of the American system. So I'm hoping university. I mean, Yale's right now, knock wood, is it's fine. It's quiet for whatever reasons. I think we have good leadership, and there's now increasing pushback. That universities, the wealthy ones, I think, can afford to ride it out. The bigger issue is education and getting people better educated.
Mm.
Honestly,
Yeah,
which
in
is
US, that's another, like, I actually didn't even think of that in this conversation, but that's another kind of strange trend at the moment. Like, literacy scores and things like that aren't looking very good in America compared to some other countries. So that's like it's almost like a peripheral issue, but it does overlap with this kind of maybe trend towards decline. Do you think, like,
yeah.
they're
No,
just loose ends?
yeah, no, this is all it's all symptomatic, and it's in a sense it's natural. In a sense, I mean, if we don't do any exercise, we get kind of weak and we lose muscles, and I mean, we have to push back against the natural forces. We've always been anti-intellectual in the country. We have great universities there, thank goodness, but we've always been anti-intellectual too, suspicious of Europe and European things, and so that is a feature of American society since the 17th century, even before. And we have to push back against that. We have to be more inclusive. It's calling us. The answers are obvious,
Yeah, yeah.
we're just hoping that things prevail and that it doesn't get too ugly. But the American Civil War was as ugly as these things
True.
ever get in human history.
A-
Um,
And the late '60s were pretty ugly from what I
the
from what I
late
know. So I
60s
guess,
the late
yeah,
60s
yeah.
is another. another period of this demographic issue that Peter Turchin, in fact, talks about. And I think we're in one now. Education is part of it. Popular immiseration is also a feature where people can't afford health care, and it's like craziness. All the symptoms are there, and we know why they are there. And there's intra-elite competition, just like the Roman Republic at the end, where there are counter elites being formed. Everyone in Washington now pretty much is a counter elite trying to replace elites. That's why universities are under attack. That's why elite institutions elsewhere are under attack. It's a counter elite forming, which has happened in history. You can see all of it. It's what's frustrating is you can see all this dynamic. We know why things are happening the way they are, and in fact, when why now? This is pretty well understood in historical dynamics literature. Peter Turchin again has written a lot on this for a long time. So we have the tools to counter this, but it requires a certain kind of mobility of a population to say no, and that's
Yeah.
still the question mark.
Yeah. I guess maybe one more question. Sorry, you've kind of just
That's
you've
okay. It's your
intrigued me a
show.
bit.
Yeah.
Do you think that like do you think there's a little bit of fault on the universities for maybe I guess entertaining populist ideas of their own kind on the left? Do you think that invited some of this and some of this Trumpist pushback, or do you think that's too harsh?
No, societies. There was clearly a pendulum swing all the way over around certain issues. And
Okay.
I have felt for 20 years, maybe longer. Okay, there's going to be pushback here because we're going maybe a bit too far on some things. It's very hard to find an equilibrium
Yeah.
in an extremely diverse
Yeah.
society.
Exactly. With blue
So
states and red states. Yeah.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
and urban, rural. The same is true. The same is true in Europe on
Yeah.
some of these divides between rural Swiss society and Bern or Zurich. I mean, or in Britain, there are these tensions that are being magnified. They've always been there. So we have to figure out ways within a democratic system to be reasonable, to respond to things like the 2008-9 financial crisis that really impacted working class in the country way more than people understood. We thought we got through it, but people were really hurt by that financial crisis. They lost trust in the government. They lost trust in how the society is advantaging a certain kind of elite. So you can understand elite pushback. I live in a rural area of Connecticut, which is full of right wingers, and I have but no problem. I have no problem. I have no problem with them. I understand why they're angry. They're generally good people that have issues. The issues are understandable. You can't afford health care in this crazy society. This is terrible. And the only question, and we have bad leadership that's incentivized to stay in power in certain ways, which is really bad. We've had some bad Supreme Court decisions around money in politics,
Mm.
which has also accelerated this divide and how Washington D.C. works politically. It should be unacceptable to all of us. It's not about left or right. Now I sound like a politician. It is about right or wrong. It is about what kind of society do we want to live in, which gets to climate change, by the way. It's part of this overall question of how do we want to live as a society? How much change is going to be acceptable? How do we want wealth distributed? Is it acceptable to have a billionaire class that's sucking 90% of wealth?
Mm.
Intergenerationally. Again, you can understand the Marxist socialist pushback. It's dangerous for a society that this level of intergenerational wealth passed from one to the other. It keeps all the wealth captured by a tiny part of the population, and everyone else is fighting for scraps, for
Yeah,
unions,
yeah.
for anyway.
Sometimes I think like that those right wingers that you mentioned might have been better off voting for Bernie Sanders, only with maybe the socially
Yeah.
conservative element in there as well, rather than what
No,
they got.
exactly.
Because
No, they're voting
yeah,
against their interest. They're voting. They're
it's
allowing
strange.
billionaires to completely abuse them and the society, which is what wealthy have done in human history. Always, it's the typical behavior that also the Greek world faced. We have to figure out politically how to solve this problem.
Yeah,
It is about economics. It's about everything else. So it's all involved together in a world where there's more stress with climate change. That's putting pressure on electricity prices, on insurance prices. Which we see now everywhere, because of this is the hidden impact of climate change, that insurance companies are all over because that's how they make a living, or not. It's already in their models, but
yeah,
politically, we're not allowed to talk about climate change. It's absurd
yeah,
because it is
yeah,
it
yeah,
is it is quite driving a lot of things rather
yeah,
quietly.
yeah,
Anyway,
yeah, yeah. No,
we have to talk more to each other. We have to figure out, well, what kind of society do we want to live in? What's
yeah,
what's acceptable? And AI,
yeah,
of course, is only amping up the
yeah.
temperature more.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I could keep going with this
Anyway,
forever, so I better cut
yeah,
it.
it's great.
So, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
That's a
That
pleasure,
was
Donald.
an amazing
Really good.
conversation. I learned a lot.